one of the authors that I enjoy. She had not written much until even prior to her death. Her name was Beryl Markham. Kind of an odd spelling, B-E-R-Y-L, Markham. She wrote a book. It's released in 1942. It's called West with the Night. Beryl Markham family came from England to northeastern Africa, principally in Kenya, where her father was raised racehorses and also had a coffee plantation. She grew up in Africa from the time she was like 2 or 3 on up through adulthood. Lived an interesting life. She was a pilot, very first woman to ever hold a commercial pilot's license in the entire continent of Africa. She was the first woman to ever have at least what they had available then. She was the first one to ever start and run her own airlines. So she was actually quite an active and busy person. She raced horses. She trained racehorses. So she was just quite a cosmopolitan woman, especially for the time. One of the items that she mentioned in her book, West with the Night, was an episode regarding her father's parrot. And I'd like to read that for you. This is Beryl Markham quoting her. "I smile to myself, remembering Bumbafu. What brings him to mind, I don't know, but suddenly there he is. Bumbafu means fool in Swahili. At Nunjaro, it meant my father's parrot. Poor Bumbafu. One day he whistled for destruction, and it came. How sad, how naked, how disillusioned he was after the moment of his greatest triumph had shone upon him like a gleam of light, then abandoned him to the darkness of despair. They were proud feathers Bumbafu gave to the cause of his learning. Pretty feathers, long and rich, stained with jungle color. How proudly he wore them. How proudly he clasped the perch on the square room outside of my father's study, day after day, looking with truculent, bemused, or falsely philosophic eyes on all who entered, on all the dogs of the motley pack my father fancied at that time, and these were the undoing of Bumbafu. Dogs are simple things. He saw that. They were controlled with a single sound. A man could stand in the doorway of his house and make that sound with his lips, and the pack would come. But who could make sounds if not Bumbafu? Was he to remain a bird on a stick the whole of his long, long life? Was there nothing but seeds and water, water and seeds for a being as elegant as he? Who had such feathers? Who had such a beak? Who could not call a dog? Bumbafu could. He did. He practiced week after week, but so cleverly that we seldom heard him. He practiced the abracadabra of calling dogs until he knew, as well as he knew the shape of the bar to which he clung, that no dog that had ever sought a flea could resist his summons. And he was not wrong. They came. One morning, when the house was empty, Bumbafu slipped his perch, and he called the dogs. I heard it too. I heard the quick, urgent whistle that was my father's whistle, though my father was miles away. I looked across the courtyard and saw Bumbafu, resplendent, confident, almost masterful, as he trod the open door sill on a hooked, impatient toes, his brilliant breast puffed and swelling, his green and all too empty head cocked with insolence. "Come one, come all," the whistle said. "It is I, Boombafu, calling." And so they came. Long dogs, short dogs, swift dogs, hungry dogs, running from the stables, from the huts, from the shade of the trees where they dozed, while Boombafu danced under the portals of his doom and whistled louder. I could run too in those days, but not so fast as that. Not fast enough to prevent the frustration of an anticipant dog from curdling with fury at the sight of this vain mop of gaudy feathers committing forgery of the master's voice, insulting all of dogdom with the cheek of it, holding to ridicule the canine clan, promising even what could be worse, a scrap or a bone, yet giving nothing. And that's the rub. That was the injury heaped on insult. Boombafu went down. He went under. He disappeared, only to rise again, feather by feather. His blaze of glory, it was no abstract one. It floated in the air in crimson and chrome yellow, in green and blue and subtler shades, a burst, a galaxy, a comet's tail of scraps and pieces. Sad bird, unhappy bird. He lived. He sat again on his perch, his eyes half closed and dull, a single tattered wing to hide his nakedness, a single moment to remember. So suffered Boombafu, and suffer still for all I know. Parrots are ageless, though blessed, I suspect, with memories too short to be fatal. Brethren, Boombafu is an example of someone who wanted to be the leader of the pack. But when it came to the leadership, he didn't have the skills, the training, or the aptitude. You know, leadership as a secular study is a very popular and broad topic. You can go on Amazon and just stick in the term leadership or leaders and looking for books that have information on leadership, and you're going to be handed back 24,760 different titles of books that contain information on leadership. It's not a new topic even in modern times, and as far back as the 1930s. Remember the book, and some of you have read it, and I think all of us have heard about it, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Dale Carnegie, you know, it was written back in the 30s. That was all on leadership and in using people to get things done. Of course, there are biblical examples that we have, and we are able to look through the pages of the Bible, very important examples. And we want to take a look at some men and women today and look at them as they exhibited godly leadership qualities, and look at those qualities and understand that they are the emblems of godly leadership. And we'll start with one example, that being that there is a quality in men and women who become and exhibit leadership qualities that honor God, in other words, exhibit godly leadership qualities, in that sometimes God will call on someone and give them a task, and as good as they are as being leaders, brethren, they also have to be good followers and accept what it is that God instructs them and wants them to do in their lives. A good example of this, and Mr. Vaughn mentioned Abraham, I'll mention Abram, who is Abraham just a few years before he became Abraham. In Genesis 12, verse 1, and really you know the story of Abraham where he was in his homeland, apparently a man of wealth even at that time, power pretty much established in wherever it was that he was. And yet we see in Genesis 12, verse 1, we see now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get you out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house into a land that I will show you." Verse 2. Then God goes on to explain what he's going to do for Abram when he follows this instruction. "And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." Verse 3. "And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you, and in you shall all families of the earth be blessed." Brethren, let's stop right there a minute and think about Abram. Abram was a man of substance. He, even in the secular sense, apparently was quite a powerful leader. He was powerful through wealth, and apparently we see in an episode that occurred where in Genesis 14, where he had to field an army of over 300 men, we see that he was powerful physically and militarily also. The man had resources. And people who operate on that level, they don't take orders very well, a lot of times. But an interesting characteristic about Abram, we see in the early verses, God said, "I want you to pack up and I want you to go someplace." And even as powerful a man as Abram was, his relationship with God was such that he had built such a respect for God and for what God stood for and what God wanted for him and for the world. We see in verse 4, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him." Abraham was an obedient man, and he was a follower when it came time for him to follow God's instruction. We see something similar in another example in Jeremiah. Jeremiah, we see in Jeremiah 1, verse 4, we see, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying," verse 5, "Before I formed you in the belly, I knew you, and before you came forth out of the womb, I sanctified you, and I ordained you a prophet to the nations." You know, Jeremiah at this time would have apparently been somewhere in his early teens. How would you like to be a young teenage man or woman and you get this information from God where you're told, "I formed you, I knew you, I am preparing you for this job"? Pretty disconcerting, I would think. Verse 6, "Then I, Jeremiah, he said, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child." That's the only resistance pretty much he gave to God. He's just reminding, "Hey, I'm kind of young here. I'm not sure people are going to listen to me." And then verse 7, "The Lord said to me, say not, I am a child, for you shall go to all that I will send you, and whomsoever I command you, or whatever I command you, you will speak." And we see in Jeremiah 52 chapters of a very detail of his life, and we see there, in fact, Jeremiah lived his life accepting God's instructions, following his direction, and moving forward. Another example, one that I find interesting, is Amos. In Amos 1, verse 1, it says here, the words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa. Brethren, in modern terms, we might read who was among the cattlemen of Tekoa. He was a cowboy. He was a man who operated and lived and made his living with livestock. It says here, among the cattlemen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So Amos was given a task, and he chose to follow God's instructions and to submit to what it is God wanted him to do. And an interesting little inset, and we see that, in fact, he did follow God's instructions. An interesting little inset in chapter 7 of verse 13. We see here that some of the people that Amos was having to deal with, they really did not want to listen to what he had to say. And they tried to stop him from prophesying. And they came to him, verse 13, but prophesy not any more in Bethel, for it is the king's chapel and the king's court. And then answered Amos, skipping ahead, he reminded them, look, guys, I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son, but I was a cattleman, I was a herdman, and a gatherer of sycamore fruit, verse 15. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. Now, I love this verse because he was kind of drawing a line in the sand, and he was saying, now, therefore, hear you the word of the Lord. Amos was kind of saying, look, guys, this is not my idea. I was a cattleman. I had orchards. I was doing anything but prophesying and preaching. It's not in my heritage. I have no pedigree to do this. God told me to do it. I'm doing it, and you're going to listen. Rest of the verse, and you say, prophesy not against Israel. No, I'm prophesying, and you guys are going to have to listen to this. Very powerful. These are examples. Abram, Jeremiah, and Amos, just 3 examples. Of course, God's word is full of them. 3 examples of where 3 people were tapped on the shoulder for a responsibility that they didn't particularly ask for. They didn't, probably weren't even, it wasn't even in their thoughts. But they were people whom God called and put into a mission, a specific task that he wanted them to do, and they chose to be good followers. Brethren, for you and I, perhaps we should keep in mind, as God's people, we don't always get to choose our leadership roles. But we do need to be to the point in our relationship with God where we can be dedicated to follow the course that is set by God. Another element of godly leadership is that godly leaders don't make spiritual decisions based on social convention. Godly leaders don't make spiritual decisions based on social convention. Daniel was a man who faced many obstacles and who remained faithful to God throughout and exercised his prerogative to maintain his relationship with God on a systematic basis, on a close systematic basis. And that didn't always put him in favor with the people around him, because as his relationship with God developed, God blessed him and moved him into positions of power, moved him into very powerful leadership positions, in fact. But He was a man who received a lot of jealousy from the people around him. In Daniel 6, verse 3, it reads, "Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm." That's how much favor that God had given him with the king. Verse 4, "Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none. There was no occasion nor fault. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him." Verse 5, "Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against David, except," what did they focus on? "Except we find it against him concerning the law of God." Isn't that interesting? The only thing they could find to accuse him of was keeping the law of God. Now, we kind of have to keep in mind that in the time that Daniel lived, the king, King Darius, was the final word in the land. There was no one above him. What he said went, and it was unquestioned, and you just accepted it and went on. And what happened is, and I won't read the verses, I'll just explain, that these men developed this plan where they were going to talk the king, apparently he was someone who they could influence, they were going to talk the king into issuing a decree that says, look, for the next 30 days, you can't ask anything of anybody but me. If you want something, you got to come to me for it. And probably that was just for the folks in the government. Wouldn't be for the whole nation probably. But it definitely included Daniel, and he was vulnerable because at that time, with that decree, King Darius became the last word. Daniel 6, verse 7. "All presidents of the kingdom, the governors, princes, and counselors, and captains had consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save the king, he shall be cast in the den of lions." You know, Daniel knew of the decree. He had to. He was in the government, very high, right next to the king. But did it stop him in maintaining his relationship with God? The answer is no, it did not. Daniel 6, verse 10. "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went to his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he knelt on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done before." His relationship with God continued. The convention that he was having to deal with in that social and legal convention, in that it was unfortunate. Daniel undoubtedly knew that there might be consequences, but he did not allow himself to jeopardize his relationship with God by being afraid or being put off by what was happening in society at that time. Daniel 6, verse 11. "These men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spoke to the king concerning his decree." And undoubtedly, you know, in your mind's eye, you can kind of hear what was said, but it was all focused on Daniel to take him out so that they wouldn't have to contend with this young upstart who wasn't even of our country. He came in as a slave, and here this guy is about to become second in command. And they wanted to stop it. Well, King Darius, we see in verses 14 through 19, King Darius really regretted that decree. But it wasn't something he could just say, well, let's just cancel it. It's not the way it worked. Once a decree at that level was made, it had to be followed through. Even the king was required to. So Daniel was taken, and he was thrown in the lion's den. Daniel 6, verse 20. And when King Darius came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. The king spoke and said, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve continually able to deliver you from the lions? And there was just silence because they had eaten him. No, they didn't. Verse 21, then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. Brethren, there's another example of someone who faced a extremely stressful point of decision, and that's Esther. Esther was a citizen of Persia, and I won't go into the details, but in life she found herself ultimately as queen to King Ahasuerus, king of Persia. Now, Esther was a Jewish woman, and King Ahasuerus had a lieutenant called Haman who really was anti-Semitic. We see in Esther 3, verse 8, Haman went to King Ahasuerus and said, there are certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. And those certain people, whom he didn't name there, but he was referring to, was the Jewish population. And their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not the king's profit to suffer them. Verse 9, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those who have charge of this business, and to bring it into the king's treasuries. He was serious. He wanted to wipe out every last Jew in Persia and in the kingdom. Well, the story didn't end there. Esther was faithful to her God. There's a lot of discussion back and forth with an uncle. But Esther took steps, moved forward, knowing absolutely that the steps she took put her in mortal danger, because apparently at that point, no one in the king's household knew she was Jewish. So she very likely could have, regardless of what happened to everybody else, she very likely could have gotten away with things and been safe, at least for a while. But that's not what she did, brethren. We see in chapter 4, verse 16, she made the statement, look, I can't stand here and do nothing. Paraphrasing, of course. And if things go badly and I lose my life in the process, so be it. Brethren, you and I know the end of this story. She took the necessary steps. God honored that. And in a rather unique set of events, she was able to turn the tables on Haman, and she prevailed. Brethren, Esther had the courage to stand on her spiritual values. She did not allow the social convention of the time, which could have been to her advantage, personal advantage, She didn't allow it to keep her away from making the correct spiritual choices in her life. You know, both Daniel and Esther exhibited a characteristic of character. There was an interesting comment made by David Rothkopf in a book that he wrote. David Rothkopf is an educator and a news commentator. In a book he wrote called Running the World, he just made the observation, when we examine the evolution of the U.S. government from 1947 to the present, we discover that no other factor is more central to determining whether we succeed or fail in preserving or advancing our national interest and ideas than the character of the people that we put in positions to lead us. The crises of recent years, and the recent years here that he's referring to are the Gulf War years. The crises of the recent years not only reveal the character of our leaders, and certainly in each crisis, the character of the president's team was almost as important to determine the outcome as was the character of the leader himself. With George Washington, the United States and the world were lucky. The modern era has been bounded by tests against the standard that he set. America's moment of great glory came when, in an era of the greatest generation, we rose to that challenge and emulated him, being Washington. Today, our futures hang in the balance because we have not followed the path set by our first leader 200 years ago. Where we go from here will be determined by whether we understand the contrast between our actions in recent history and their implications for the world of the future. As in Washington's day, it's a circle. Events call out for great men rise up, and then, as the philosophers of old have said, character determines fate. Brethren, the character exhibited by Daniel and Esther, regardless of the social convention, it preserved their lives, and certainly in the case of Esther, the lives of hundreds, maybe even millions of fellow Jews. Another element that we find in godly leaders is that godly leaders see the hard times for what they are. Godly leaders see the hard times for what they are. Proverbs 3, verse 1, Solomon said, "My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of his correction. For in whom the Lord loves, he corrects, even as a father the child in whom he delights." Brethren, over the years I've thought about David, and at times with his conduct, in my own mind, I have not been particularly charitable toward him. My view is mitigated quite a lot over the last few years because I began to really understand, or at least get some insight into what was going on with David. And we have some quite ugly examples of David making some very serious decisions that injured himself and a lot of other people in the process. We know in the matter of Bathsheba, for example, that David took another man's wife, wound up killing her husband, and having a child by Bathsheba. And he just forged right ahead. It was just one bad decision after another. Until he was confronted by Nathan. Nathan the prophet went to David regarding Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 12, and we see in 2 Samuel 12, and I won't read those verses, Nathan confronted David directly. And he said, this matter of Bathsheba has put you in a situation that absolutely angers God, and he's not going to put up with it any longer. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. But this conduct stops today. That was the bottom line. 2 Samuel 12, verse 13, David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, and the Lord hath put away your sin, you shall not die. Interesting turn of events. You know, there's an interesting parallel here, and it's not an exact parallel, but it's kind of interesting. Dr. Bren Brown from the University of Houston did a study some years ago. She's a research professor there, and did a study of the successful leaders out of the Silicon Valley. And, of course, you know the rumor, and apparently it's true. You've got to fail or you're not respected in the Silicon Valley. If you're a leader and you run a company and your resume doesn't have a string of bankruptcies on it, you get no respect. They expect you to make mistakes. They expect you to step out and risk. They expect it because they understand it to be part of creativity. And Dr. Brown did an extensive study, very interesting. And she summed up, she said, she finally came to the place where she just summed up what she saw in the leadership in Silicon Valley in one small little phrase. She said, you can summarize everything I saw in all the pages of my study by this one mantra. Fail first, fail often, clean it up, and move on. Now, by that, I'm not suggesting you need to fail or sin first and sin often. That's not my point at all. The point is, and David picked up on it, when the failure came, David moved forward. And we see that in Psalms 51. Psalms 51:1, have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgression, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin, for I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. And we see in verses 17 through 19 where David cleaned up his act and he moved on. Brethren, godly leaders, in good times and bad, and even in bad times that are self-induced, learn the lessons and incorporate those lessons and get on with life. Now, brethren, these are just a few examples. This doesn't even begin to cover all of the elements of godly leadership that we see in the examples of men and women's lives in God's Word. Brethren, why should we care? Very few in this audience are leaders of industry or political leaders. Why should you and I care? Peter explained that. 1 Peter 2, verse 9, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you will show forth the praises of him who has called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. in verse 10, which in times past were not a people, but now are a people, which hath not obtained mercy, but now has mercy. John confirmed Peter's observation, Revelation 1 verse 4. Revelation 1 verse 4. John to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace be to you and peace from him which is and was and which is to come, from the 7 spirits which are before his throne. Verse 5, and from Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness, the first begotten of the dead, prince of the kings of the earth, unto him who loves us and washed us from our sins in his own blood. Verse 6, and has made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Brethren, you and I have a future to prepare for. I don't care what you do today, where you are in society, what your race is, what your financial situation is, what your background is. You and I have a future to prepare for. And we need to study to understand the elements of godly leadership, because those are elements we need to incorporate into our lives and have those in our tool chest when it comes our turn to be the kings and the priests in the world tomorrow. Another reason we should care is we need to understand the difference between godly leadership and secular leadership in order to protect ourselves in a culture of wannabe leaders. Rather than popular culture, you know what I'm talking about. It's on TV. It's in all of the different medias. Popular culture, the influence of politics, those things are influencing our culture and our people around us in this country, and they're dangerous. There's an interesting allegory in Judges 9 concerning leadership. Judges 9:8. Several verses here, but let me read them. Judges 9:8. The trees went forth on a time to anoint a king over them. And they said unto the olive tree, reign over us. Verse 9, the olive tree said to them, should I leave my fatness, wherewith by me they honor God and man, and go to be promoted over the trees? Verse 10, trees then went to the fig tree. Come you reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I forsake my sweetness, my good fruit, and go to be promoted to lead the trees? Then the trees said to the vine, you come and reign over us. You be our leader. Verse 13, the vine said to them, should I leave my wine that cheers God and man and go promoted and be promoted to lead the trees? Verse 14, then the trees said unto the bramble, come you reign over us. Verse 15, and the bramble said to the trees, if in a truth you anoint me king over you, and come and put your trust in my shadow, but if not, let the fire come out of the bramble, and I will devour the cedars of Lebanon. Brethren, that's our leadership today. That's our worldly leadership. And you can take away from those verses and apply them to what we see around us. Brethren, we're not getting the best and the brightest. We're not. You can look at government. You can even look in some businesses, especially some of the old line businesses. They're not getting the best and brightest leaders. They're wannabes. They're often characterless pretenders. And we need to be careful to not put our faith in that type of leadership. So we need to be armed and fully aware of what it is that constitutes godly leadership. And then third, we need to understand the elements of godly leadership in order to protect yourselves, your loved ones, and other church members against attacks on the church. Now, brethren, I don't have any specific thing in mind, but Christ left us warnings. Matthew 10, verse 16, Christ said, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be you therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Verse 17, "Be aware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils. They will scourge you in their synagogues, and you shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles." Backing up to Matthew 7, verse 15, Christ said here to beware of false prophets. Keep in mind, the prophets, the ministry, the leaders in the synagogues, they were leaders at that time. Christ was saying, beware of the leadership which comes to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are raving wolves. Brethren, he didn't call them misguided, misunderstood, or otherwise decent folks. He said they're raving wolves. We need to know, brethren, who we're dealing with in life. Matthew 7, verse 16 to continue, "You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?" Verse 17, "Even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit, and a good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, nor a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit." And we won't go there, but for the fruits of the Holy Spirit, I refer you to Galatians 5, 22 and 23, and also 2 Peter 1, verses 5 through 7. Brethren, our parrot, Boombafu, was everything that a godly leader is not. He was all flash, no substance, and violated every leadership principle there was. You and I have discussed a few principles or a few people out of the Bible, a few examples, but there are many, many more we could have discussed. But I bring this subject up, brethren, because we need to incorporate these qualities, these spiritual principles of godly leadership in our lives. And in doing so, we need to learn to be godly followers, look to God for guidance, accept trials as part of our leadership training, and display the character to stand on godly principles and not yield to social convention when it's in conflict with God's law. Brethren, we need to do so because we are the leaders of the future. But for a more immediate concern, we need to recognize the fruits of godly leadership to protect ourselves from the cultural pressures that we have around us, and to protect ourselves, our brethren, and the church from the wolves described by Christ in Matthew 7, verse 15.